There's nothing quite like the pain of losing a child, and nothing quite like the hope of finding family again. For shield-maiden Brynhild, those wounds have shaped 20 years of wandering the frozen mountains of ancient Norway, avoiding the world that took everything from her. But when she discovers a young woman left for dead in the snow, something stirs in her heart that she thought had died long ago. The stranger carries a pendant marked with runes that seem familiar, and speaks of visions that connect to Brynhild's own past. As winter traps them together in her mountain refuge, Brynhild begins to wonder if fate has brought her exactly what she's been searching for. The girl's mysterious origins hold secrets that could change everything. But will uncovering the truth about this stranger's identity give Brynhild the family she's longed for, or destroy the fragile peace she's built in solitude? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountain path had grown familiar beneath Brynhild's boots over the past 2 decades, worn smooth by her solitary journeys between the scattered pine groves and rocky outcroppings that marked her territory. At 53, she moved with the measured gait of someone who had learned to conserve energy for when it truly mattered, her weathered hands steady on the walking staff she'd carved from ironwood years ago. The December wind carried the scent of snow and something else, something that made her pause mid-step and lift her grizzled head to scan the white expanse ahead. Her refuge sat nestled in a natural depression between 2 peaks, invisible to casual travelers, but perfectly positioned to watch the ancient trade routes that wound through the valley below. She had chosen this place deliberately after Astrid's death, seeking isolation that would protect her from the memories that haunted every familiar settlement. The cabin itself was a testament to her skills as both warrior and survivor. Thick stone walls chinked with moss and clay, a slate roof that shed snow efficiently, and narrow windows that could be shuttered against both weather and unwelcome visitors. Above the great stone fireplace hung her war axe, its blade still keen despite years of disuse. The weapon had been her constant companion through a dozen major battles, its weight as familiar as her own heartbeat. The leather-wrapped handle bore the scars of countless conflicts, and the steel itself seemed to hold memories of the shield wall formations where she had earned her reputation as one of the fiercest warriors in all of Norway. Yet now it served merely as a reminder of the life she had abandoned, gathering dust while she tended her small garden and trapped game in the surrounding forests. The years before Astrid's birth had been filled with glory and purpose. Brynhild had stood beside her husband Eric in the front ranks of King Harald's forces, her shield locked with those of her sisters in arms as they faced Danish raiders and Swedish incursions. The rhythmic clash of steel on steel, the roar of battle cries echoing across blood-soaked fields, the fierce joy of survival earned through skill and courage, these had been the defining experiences of her youth. She had been known as Brynhild the Unflinching, feared by enemies and respected by allies for her unwavering courage in the face of overwhelming odds. But motherhood had changed everything. When Eric fell during a raid on Danish settlements, Brynhild found herself torn between her duty as a warrior and her responsibility to their infant daughter. She had tried to balance both roles, bringing 3-year-old Astrid to training grounds and teaching her the basics of weaponcraft, while still answering the call to battle when threatened. The little girl had shown promise, her small hands steady on a child-sized wooden sword, her blue eyes bright with the same fierce intelligence that had made her mother legendary. The memory of that terrible spring morning 20 years ago still had the power to stop Brynhild's breath. She had returned from a 3-day scouting mission to find their settlement in ruins, smoke rising from burned longhouses, and bodies scattered across the muddy ground. The Danish raiders had come in overwhelming numbers, seeking revenge for Eric's successful raids on their territory. They had shown no mercy to the women, children, and elderly left behind, while the warriors pursued other threats. She had found Astrid's small body near the well, where the child had probably been drawing water for the morning meal. The sight had shattered something fundamental in Brynhild's soul, transforming her from a confident shield maiden into a hollow shell of grief and rage. The axe had drunk deeply that day as she tracked down every raider she could find, but vengeance brought no relief from the crushing weight of loss. Nothing could bring back the bright laughter that had filled their home or the warm weight of small arms around her neck. After the funeral rites, Brynhild had simply walked away from everything she had ever known. She took only her weapons, a few tools, and the clothes on her back, leaving behind her reputation, her lands, and her identity as anything more than a broken woman seeking solitude. The mountains had welcomed her with their indifferent silence, offering the kind of peace that came from complete isolation from human concerns. In the years that followed, she had built her new life carefully and deliberately. The cabin became both fortress and sanctuary, stocked with preserved foods, medicinal herbs, and the basic necessities for surviving harsh winters. She learned to find satisfaction in simple tasks, splitting firewood with perfect efficiency, tracking deer through virgin snow, or carving useful items from fallen timber. The work kept her hands busy, and her mind focused on immediate needs rather than dwelling on memories that brought only pain. Her daily routines had become almost ritualistic in their precision. Dawn brought the checking of snares and the collection of firewood. Midday was for hunting or gathering herbs, depending on the season. Evenings were spent in the practical tasks of maintaining her gear, preparing food, and tending the fire that never went completely cold. She spoke aloud only to herself, and then rarely, finding that silence suited her better than conversation. But today, something was different. The wrongness she had sensed earlier grew stronger as she approached a familiar bend in the trail, and her warrior's instincts, dulled but not destroyed by years of peaceful living, began to stir. Her hand moved unconsciously toward the long knife at her belt, fingers testing the worn grip as her eyes scanned the snowy landscape with renewed intensity. The discovery, when it came, hit her with the force of a physical blow. A young woman lay crumpled in a drift of snow beside the old battle trail, her dark hair spread across the white surface like spilled ink. She wore simple traveling clothes that offered little protection against the bitter cold, and her skin had taken on the waxy pallor that spoke of severe exposure. But what captured Brynhild's attention immediately was the pendant visible at her throat, a piece of intricate silverwork that caught the pale sunlight and seemed to pulse with its own inner warmth. Brynhild knelt beside the still form, her practiced hands checking for signs of life, while her mind raced through possibilities. The girl was young, perhaps 20 summers, with the kind of delicate features that suggested noble birth, despite her simple clothes. Her breathing was shallow but steady, and her pulse, though weak, maintained a regular rhythm beneath Brynhild's fingers. Frostbite had begun to claim her exposed skin, but the damage appeared manageable if treated quickly. The pendant drew her attention again as she prepared to lift the unconscious woman. The silver was worked in patterns that seemed both ancient and familiar, incorporating symbols that tugged at memories she couldn't quite place. Runes spiraled around a central design that might have been a tree or perhaps a mountain, while smaller symbols nested in the curves and angles like hidden messages waiting to be decoded. The metal itself was warm to the touch despite the freezing air, suggesting either recent contact with body heat or something more mysterious. As Brynhild gathered the limp form in her arms, she felt something shift inside her chest, a stirring of protective instincts she had thought buried with her daughter. The girl was surprisingly light, her body angular in a way that suggested recent hunger or hardship, and her clothes smelled of wood smoke and pine needles rather than the usual sense of settlement life. Everything about her spoke of someone who had been living rough, possibly for weeks or even months. The journey back to the cabin tested even Brynhild's considerable strength. The unconscious woman represented dead weight that had to be carried carefully over uneven terrain, and the growing wind threatened to turn the afternoon into a full blizzard. But something drove her forward with unusual urgency, as if the very act of saving this stranger might somehow balance the scales of fate that had taken so much from her. By the time she reached her refuge, snow was falling, in thick curtains that reduced visibility to mere yards. She kicked open the heavy door and carried her burden directly to the sleeping alcove where thick furs and wool blankets waited. The girl's breathing had grown more labored during the journey, and her skin felt cold as winter stone, despite the layers Brynhild had wrapped around her. The next hours blurred together in a focused routine of emergency care. Brynhild built up the fire until the cabin glowed with warmth, then set about the delicate work of treating severe exposure. She knew from hard experience how to balance the need for warming against the dangers of shocking a frozen system, gradually bringing the girl's body temperature back to normal while watching for signs of frostbite or worse, complications. As she worked, cleaning and bandaging minor cuts while massaging circulation back into numb extremities, Brynhild found herself studying the stranger's face with growing fascination. There was something hauntingly familiar about her features, the high cheekbones, the strong jawline, the way her dark eyebrows arched, even in unconsciousness. It was probably just the universal vulnerability of youth that stirred these protective feelings, she told herself. But the resemblance to someone half-remembered nagged at her thoughts. The pendant remained warm throughout the treatment, its silver surface unmarked, despite obvious signs that the girl had been through considerable hardship. As night fell outside and the storm intensified, Brynhild settled into her usual chair beside the fire, but sleep eluded her. Instead, she found herself watching the steady rise and fall of her patient's breathing and wondering what circumstances had brought a lone woman to this remote stretch of wilderness in the depths of winter. Tomorrow would bring questions that needed answers, but tonight was for keeping watch and ensuring that her unexpected guest survived to see another dawn. The cabin felt different with another presence sharing its warmth, less like a hermit's retreat and more like what it had once been intended to be, a home where people cared for one another against the harsh realities of the world outside. The girl's eyes opened on the third morning like winter lakes, reflecting sudden sunlight, pale blue and startlingly aware. Brynhild had been tending the fire when she heard the soft intake of breath behind her, and when she turned, those eyes were watching her with an intensity that made her hand instinctively move toward her knife. "Where am I?" The voice was soft but clear, carrying an accent Brynhild couldn't quite place. The words were modern Norse, but shaped with the careful precision of someone who had learned the language formally rather than growing up with it. "Safe," Brynhild replied, setting down the poker and approaching the sleeping alcove with deliberate slowness. "You've been unconscious for 3 days. I found you in the snow near the old battle trail." The girl woman, really, for despite her youth, she carried herself with adult composure, pushed herself up against the furs, wincing as movement reminded her of various injuries. Her gaze swept the cabin's interior with the methodical attention of someone assessing potential threats and escape routes. When her eyes reached the war axe above the fireplace, they lingered there with what looked like recognition. "That's a beautiful weapon," she said, surprising Brynhild with the observation. "5th-century craftsmanship, if I'm not mistaken. The balance point suggests it was made for someone of considerable skill." Brynhild's eyebrows rose. Most people, especially young women, wouldn't know a war axe from a woodcutter's tool, much less be able to identify its age and quality at a glance. "You have an unusual education for someone found dying in a snowdrift." "I suppose I do." The stranger's hand moved unconsciously to her throat, fingers finding the pendant that still rested against her skin. As she touched it, something remarkable happened. The ancient healing stones that Brynhild kept arranged on a shelf near the sleeping area began to emit a faint, blue-white glow. Both women stared at the stones in stunned silence. Brynhild had inherited them from her grandmother, who claimed they were blessed by the old gods and could ease pain for those pure of heart. In all her years, she had never seen them do more than remain, pleasantly warm to the touch. "How did you do that?" Brynhild asked, her voice tight with suspicion. "I don't know." The girl's fingers tightened on the pendant, and the glow from the stones intensified slightly before fading back to normal. "I don't remember much of anything, really. There are fragments cold, running, being afraid, but nothing that makes sense." She swung her legs over the edge of the sleeping alcove and attempted to stand, swaying dangerously before Brynhild caught her arm. The contact sent a strange warmth up Brynhild's arm, and for a moment she could have sworn she heard distant voices speaking in Old Norse, the ancient dialect her grandmother had used for formal rituals. "Easy," Brynhild said, steadying her patient while trying to understand what had just happened. "You've been through an ordeal. Your body needs time to recover. My name is Sigrid." The words came out with sudden certainty, as if speaking them had unlocked something in her memory. "I remember that much, at least. And I know this place, somehow. Not this cabin specifically, but these mountains. I've dreamed of them." Brynhild helped her settle into the chair by the fire, noting how the flames seemed to dance more vigorously when Sigrid was near them. Everything about this young woman defied explanation, from her mysterious knowledge to the supernatural effects that followed her touch. The rational part of Brynhild's mind insisted there had to be logical explanations, but her warrior's instincts recognized something far more significant at work. "Tell me about your dreams," she said, settling into her own chair and studying Sigrid's face in the firelight. "They're not like normal dreams," Sigrid replied, her voice taking on a distant quality. "They feel more like memories, but memories of things I've never experienced. I see battles fought with bronze weapons and wooden shields. I hear voices calling in languages I shouldn't understand, but somehow do. And always, there are these mountains." As she spoke, her hand remained on the pendant, and Brynhild noticed that the silver seemed to shift and flow in the firelight, revealing different symbols depending on the angle of view. What had initially appeared to be a simple tree design now showed aspects that resembled a woman with outstretched arms, or perhaps a warrior standing over fallen enemies. "Where did you get that pendant?" Brynhild asked. Sigrid's expression grew troubled. "I've always had it, for as long as I can remember. But I can't recall who gave it to me or where it came from. Sometimes when I hold it, I hear a woman's voice telling me to find the mountain guardian. I thought it was just part of the dreams. But now," she looked around the cabin with growing wonder, "now I think I may have found her." The words sent a chill down Brynhild's spine that had nothing to do with the winter cold. Mountain Guardian was a title her grandmother had used, claiming their family line had protected these peaks for generations before the coming of the White Christ changed the old ways. She had never taken the stories seriously, dismissing them as the fantasies of an old woman clinging to outdated beliefs. "What else do you remember?" Brynhild asked carefully. "Fragments, mostly. Running through snow at night, afraid of something behind me. Voices arguing about whether I should be killed or captured. And before that," Sigrid closed her eyes, her face tightening with concentration. "A burning house, a woman screaming, the smell of blood and smoke. Outside, the wind began to howl with renewed fury, rattling the shutters and sending snow spiraling down the chimney to hiss against the flames. The storm that had been threatening all week was finally arriving in earnest, and Brynhild realized that whether she wanted it or not, she and Sigrid would be trapped together for at least a fortnight. "The weather's turning," she observed, rising to check the supplies. "We'll be snowed in until the next thaw." Sigrid nodded, apparently unsurprised by this development. "That's probably for the best. I have a feeling that whatever I was running from isn't easily discouraged." The casual way she spoke of being hunted sent another chill through Brynhild. This was no ordinary young woman seeking shelter from a storm. She was someone accustomed to danger, despite her apparent memory loss. The healing stones continued to glow faintly whenever Sigrid moved near them, and the pendant seemed to grow warmer as the storm intensified outside. "Can you fight?" Brynhild asked bluntly. I think so. Sigrid flexed her hands, studying them as if seeing them for the first time. My body seems to remember things my mind has forgotten. When you moved to check your knife earlier, I was already calculating how to disarm you and reach the door. The admission hung between them like a challenge. Here was confirmation that Sigrid possessed training and instincts that belied her claim of memory loss. Whatever she was running from, she was no helpless victim. The question was whether she represented safety or danger for Brynhild's carefully constructed solitude. As if sensing her thoughts, Sigrid leaned forward in her chair. I don't know who I really am, or why I can make ancient stones glow with a touch. I don't know who's hunting me, or what they want. But I know this, I would rather die than bring harm to someone who saved my life. The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable, and Brynhild found herself wanting to believe it, despite all her hard-earned caution. The girl's presence had already changed something fundamental in the cabin's atmosphere, bringing warmth that had nothing to do with the fire, and stirring feelings Brynhild had thought permanently buried. Then we'll figure it out together, she heard herself say, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. But first, you need proper food and rest. The mysteries can wait until you're stronger. Outside, the storm continued to build, sealing them into their mountain refuge with the thoroughness of fate itself. Whatever answers lay hidden in Sigrid's fragmented memories would have to emerge slowly, carefully, while they learned to trust each other enough to share their deepest truths. The healing stones pulsed gently in their alcove, as if blessing this tentative alliance between two women whose lives had been shaped by loss and whose futures now seemed mysteriously intertwined. The rhythm of survival established itself over the following days as the storm raged outside their sanctuary. Brynhild found herself adjusting to shared routines she hadn't experienced in 2 decades, and the presence of another person in her carefully ordered world brought both comfort and unease. Sigrid proved to be a willing helper despite her continuing weakness, insisting on contributing to their daily tasks, even when Brynhild urged her to rest. I'm not an invalid, Sigrid said on the 4th morning, rising from the sleeping alcove with visible determination. Whatever brought me here, sitting idle won't help me remember it. Brynhild watched from her position at the fire, where she was preparing their morning meal of dried fish and barley porridge. There was something in the way Sigrid moved, a fluid economy of motion that spoke of physical training that contradicted her claims of memory loss. When she reached for the water bucket, her stance automatically shifted to compensate for the weight, and when she bent to add wood to the fire, she moved with the unconscious grace of someone accustomed to physical labor. Do you know how to weave? Brynhild asked, gesturing toward the loom that occupied one corner of the cabin. Sigrid examined the wooden frame and its half-finished wool cloth with the same methodical attention she'd given the war axe. I think so, she said slowly, then moved to the bench and began working the threads with startling skill. Her fingers found the rhythm immediately, and the pattern that emerged was both traditional and somehow distinctive geometric shapes that seemed to shift in the changing light. Where did you learn to weave like that? Brynhild asked, genuinely impressed by the quality of work. I don't know, Sigrid replied, her brow furrowing with concentration. It feels familiar, like something I've done since childhood, but I can't remember being taught. As the days passed, similar mysteries accumulated. Sigrid could identify medicinal herbs by scent alone, knew which woods burned hottest and cleanest, and demonstrated an intuitive understanding of food preservation techniques that took most people years to master. She worked with the confidence of experience while claiming to remember nothing of where that experience had been gained. It was on the 7th day that the memory bowl incident occurred. Brynhild had been preparing their evening meal when she realized she needed another serving dish. Without thinking, she reached for the carved wooden bowl that sat on a high shelf, the one Astrid had used as a child, decorated with running horses and flowering vines. She had kept it all these years as one of her few tangible connections to her daughter. Here, "Use this," she said, handing the bowl to Sigrid without explanation. The moment Sigrid's fingers touched the carved wood, her entire body went rigid. Her eyes widened with what looked like recognition, and she cradled the bowl against her chest as if it were infinitely precious. "This belonged to a little girl," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "She loved horses. She used to trace these carvings with her finger while her mother told stories by the fire." Brynhild's breath caught in her throat. The description was so accurate, so specific to memories only she should possess, that for a moment she couldn't speak. How could Sigrid know about Astrid's habit of tracing the carvings, or about the nightly storytelling that had been their special tradition? "How do you know that?" Brynhild managed to ask. Sigrid looked up with tears in her eyes. "I don't know. When I touched it, I could see her, a little girl with bright blue eyes and golden hair. She was laughing at something her mother said. The woman looked—" She paused, studying Brynhild's face. "She looked like you, but younger." The silence that followed stretched between them like a bridge. Neither was sure they should cross. Brynhild took the bowl with hands that trembled slightly, setting it carefully back on its shelf. The memories it stirred were too painful to examine closely, yet Sigrid's impossible knowledge demanded explanation. "Tell me what else you saw," Brynhild said quietly. "Happiness," Sigrid replied simply. "So much love in this place. The little girl felt completely safe here, completely cherished. What happened to her?" Brynhild turned away, ostensibly to tend the fire, but really to hide the tears that threatened to fall. "She died 20 years ago. A raid while I was away. I'm sorry." The words carried a weight of understanding that seemed far beyond Sigrid's apparent years. "Losing a child, there's no pain like it in the world." The empathy in her voice suggested personal knowledge rather than mere sympathy, and Brynhild found herself wondering what losses this young woman had endured to speak with such certainty. When she turned back, Sigrid was staring into the fire with an expression of profound sadness. Their evening routine continued in subdued quiet, but something fundamental had shifted between them. The sharing of grief, even wordlessly, had created a bond that went deeper than mere hospitality. As they settled by the fire after their meal, the conversation turned naturally to stories of the past. "What was she like?" Sigrid asked. "Your daughter," Astrid was. Brynhild paused, surprised by how easily the name came after years of avoiding it. She was curious about everything, always asking questions, always wanting to understand how things worked. She would have made a fine scholar if she'd lived to see womanhood. Did she want to be a warrior like her mother? Sometimes she could handle a wooden sword better than most boys her age, but she preferred stories to fighting, learning to healing. Brynhild smiled at the memory. She used to say she wanted to be the kind of warrior who won battles with wisdom instead of steel. Sigrid nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds like the highest form of courage to me." As the fire burned lower, their conversation meandered through memories and reflections, creating an intimacy that surprised them both. Sigrid shared fragments of her disconnected dreams, describing visions of places and people that felt more real than her waking life. Brynhild found herself speaking of things she hadn't discussed in decades: her early days as a warrior, her courtship with Eric, the small domestic joys that had made their life together precious. "Do you think the dead ever try to communicate with the living?" Sigrid asked as they prepared for sleep. Brynhild considered the question carefully. "My grandmother believed they did. She said the spirits of loved ones sometimes reached across the boundary to offer guidance or comfort to those they'd left behind. Maybe that's what my visions are," Sigrid mused. "Messages from people I've lost but can't remember losing." Outside, the wind continued its relentless assault on the mountain, but inside their refuge, warmth and understanding had begun to bloom between two women who had both known profound loss. The memory bowl sat on its shelf, like a bridge between past and present, holding secrets that neither of them fully understood, but both recognized as significant. As Brynhild banked the fire for the night, she reflected on how much her world had changed in just 1 week. The silence that had once been her comfort now felt incomplete, without Sigrid's presence. The routines that had sustained her for 20 years now included another person's needs and preferences. Most surprising of all, the protective instincts she had thought buried with her daughter were stirring to life again, focused on this mysterious young woman whose past remained tantalizingly out of reach. 2 weeks into their shared confinement, Sigrid made a discovery that would forever alter the tentative trust-building between them. While Brynhild was outside checking their diminishing supply of firewood, Sigrid had been exploring the cabin's corners with the restless energy of someone finally regaining her strength. Behind a stack of preserved meat, she found something that made her gasp aloud, an ancient scroll, wrapped in oiled leather and tied with faded cord. When Brynhild returned, stamping snow from her boots and muttering about the continuing storm, she found Sigrid sitting cross-legged on the floor, with the scroll spread before her, her face pale with wonder. "You shouldn't be going through my things," Brynhild said, though her tone carried more curiosity than anger. "I'm sorry," Sigrid replied, not looking up from the parchment. "I was just moving things to sweep, and this fell out. But Brynhild, I can read this. Every word of it." Brynhild knelt beside her, examining the scroll she hadn't opened in years. The ancestor scroll was written in the archaic runic script her grandmother had taught her, a form of writing so old that few scholars could decipher it completely. Even Brynhild herself could make out only portions of the genealogy that traced their family line back through 20 generations. "That's impossible," she said. "This script hasn't been in common use for 300 years. Look." Sigrid ran her finger along the intricate characters, translating as she went. "Here it speaks of Bjorn, the far traveller, who sailed beyond the sunset and returned with tales of golden shores. His daughter Ingrid married Thorvald Ironarm and bore him 3 sons who died in the Great Plague Winter. Their surviving daughter Astrid, not your Astrid, but an earlier one, became the first of your line to be called Mountain Guardian." The accuracy of her translation sent ice through Brynhild's veins. She had struggled to decipher those very passages with her grandmother's help, and here was Sigrid reading them as easily as if they were written in modern Norse. "How is this possible?" Brynhild whispered. "I don't know," Sigrid admitted, but her eyes remained fixed on the scroll. "But there's more. Listen to this. The bloodline shall endure, though kingdoms fall and gods grow silent. When the last guardian stands alone, the lost daughter shall return, bearing the old wisdom, and the mountain's watch shall be renewed for another age." The words hung between them like a prophecy suddenly made manifest. Brynhild had heard her grandmother recite something similar during ritual observances, but she had always assumed it was metaphorical, the kind of mystical language the old religion favored. Now, facing a young woman who claimed to remember nothing, yet possessed knowledge that should have been impossible, the ancient words took on new and troubling significance. "Show me your pendant again," Brynhild said quietly. Sigrid lifted the silver chain from beneath her tunic, and in the firelight, the pendant's engravings seemed to shift and flow like living things. As Brynhild studied the intricate patterns, she began to recognize symbols that matched those carved into the hearthstone of the cabin, marks her grandmother had insisted were protective runes blessed by the old gods. "Where were you born?" she asked. "I don't remember," Sigrid replied, frustration creeping into her voice. "I've tried and tried, but there's nothing before waking up in the snow. Sometimes I catch glimpses of a woman's face, a burning building, people running, but it's like trying to hold water in my hands." As if responding to her emotional distress, the pendant began to grow warm against her skin. The silver seemed to pulse with its own inner light, and suddenly the symbols became clear to Brynhild's eyes. What she had initially taken for decorative elements revealed themselves as a complex, runic message, one that made her heart skip with recognition. "Astrid's daughter," she breathed, reading the ancient script. "Child of my child, heir to the mountain's trust." "What?" Sigrid stared down at the pendant in shock. What does that mean? But Brynhild was already rising. Moving to a wooden chest she kept hidden beneath her sleeping furs. From its depths, she withdrew a leather pouch that hadn't been opened in 20 years, her hands shaking as she loosened the drawstring. Inside lay a matching pendant, smaller and simpler, but clearly crafted by the same hand. "This was Astrid's," she said, holding up the smaller pendant. "I made them both when she was born, following patterns my grandmother taught me, one for the mother, one for the daughter. When she died, I kept hers as a remembrance." Sigrid took the smaller pendant with trembling fingers, and the moment the two pieces of silver touched, something extraordinary happened. Light blazed between them, not the gentle glow the healing stones produced, but a brilliant illumination that filled the entire cabin. For several heartbeats, the air itself seemed to sing with harmonious tones, and both women felt a presence that was ancient, benevolent, and unmistakably familiar. When the light faded, they sat in stunned silence, the two pendants now lying quiet in Sigrid's palm. "She survived," Brynhild whispered, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "My daughter survived long enough to have a child of her own. Then I'm—" Sigrid couldn't finish the sentence, overwhelmed by implications she was only beginning to understand. "My granddaughter." The words felt strange on Brynhild's tongue, filled with impossible hope and terrible grief intertwined. "But how? The bodies I found. Perhaps what you found were others who died defending her," Sigrid suggested gently. "Perhaps she escaped that day and lived long enough to grow up, to fall in love, to become a mother herself." The thought was almost too painful to contemplate. If Astrid had survived the raid, where had she gone? Who had raised her? Why hadn't she returned to the mountains, where she would have been safe? And what had happened to her that left her daughter with no memories of her own past? "The pendant knows," Sigrid said suddenly, holding up the silver disc that continued to emit faint warmth. "Somehow it holds the memories I've lost. I can feel them there, just beyond my reach." As evening approached, and they prepared their meal in contemplative quiet, both women wrestled with the enormity of this revelation. For Brynhild, it meant that the family line she thought had ended with Astrid's death continued through this remarkable young woman. For Sigrid, it provided the first solid connection to an identity that had been completely erased. "What do we do now?" Sigrid asked, as they settled by the fire. "We learn," Brynhild replied, her voice steady with newfound purpose. "We piece together what happened to your mother and what brought you to me, and we prepare you to take up the inheritance that is rightfully yours." Outside, the storm that had raged for weeks was finally beginning to subside, as if the mountains themselves approved of this reunion between the lost and the guardian. 3 days after the pendant revelation, Sigrid made another discovery that would prove far more troubling than the first. While organizing Brynhild's collection of stones and crystals, a task that had become part of their daily routine, her fingers encountered something that made the world suddenly shift around her. Hidden behind the healing stones sat a piece of clear quartz, no larger than her thumb, but when she lifted it to examine the crystal more closely, her vision exploded with images that were not her own. She saw fire and screaming, warriors with blood-stained axes pursuing fleeing villagers through streets she recognized despite never having walked them. She saw a young woman barely more than a girl with golden hair and desperate blue eyes, clutching an infant to her chest as she ran through burning buildings toward the safety of the forest. Most disturbing of all, she saw the faces of the raiders and recognized with cold certainty that some of those same men still lived. "Brynhild," she called, her voice tight with shock. The older woman hurried over from where she had been mending a torn cloak, taking in Sigrid's pale face and the crystal clutched in her trembling hand. "What is it? What's wrong?" "This stone, when I touch it, I can see things, terrible things." Sigrid held up the vision crystal with careful reverence. "I can see the raid that destroyed your settlement. I can see what happened to my mother." Brynhild's expression grew grim. That crystal belonged to Helga, the wise woman. She gave it to me the day before she died, saying it would show me truths I needed to know when the time was right. I've carried it for 20 years, but it's never shown me anything. Maybe it was waiting for the right person to hold it, Sigrid suggested. Someone with the blood to activate its power. She closed her eyes and let the visions flow more freely, trying to piece together the fragments of that terrible day. The images came in flashes: her mother Astrid, fighting desperately to protect her infant daughter, hiding the baby in a root cellar while she led the raiders away, dying with a sword in her hand and her child's name on her lips. But there was more, glimpses of a larger pattern that made Sigrid's blood run cold. It wasn't just a random raid, she said, opening her eyes to meet Brynhild's gaze. They were looking for something specific, looking for our family line. What do you mean? The crystal shows me their leader, a man with grey streaks in his beard and a scar across his left cheek. He kept asking about the mountain guardian's bloodline, about the old knowledge. When the villagers couldn't tell him what he wanted to know, he ordered the buildings burned and the people killed. Brynhild's face had gone ashen. Describe this leader more carefully. Sigrid concentrated, letting the vision crystallize in her mind. Tall, probably 40 summers at the time. He wore mail that was finer than his men's, and he carried a sword with a serpent carved into the pommel. The scar on his cheek was shaped like a crescent, and his eyes were the color of winter ice. Magnus the Ruthless, Brynhild whispered, the name falling from her lips like a curse. I should have known he was behind it. You know him? I killed his brother in single combat 3 years before Astrid died. Magnus swore vengeance on my entire bloodline. Brynhild began pacing the length of the cabin, her hands clenched into fists. If he was behind the raid, then he didn't just want revenge, he wanted something more. Something connected to our family's role as guardians. The crystal pulsed warmly in Sigrid's grip, and new visions flooded her mind. She saw Magnus as he was now older, greyer, but still alive and still searching. She saw him consulting with dark-robed figures who spoke of ancient powers and bloodline magic. Most terrifying of all, she saw him giving orders to scouts who were already searching the mountain passes. He's coming, she said urgently. The crystal shows me his men already in the lower valleys, questioning travelers about unusual occurrences. They know I'm here somehow. Brynhild stopped pacing and fixed her with an intense stare. How could they possibly know that? I don't know, but I can see them. 3 days hard riding from here, if the weather holds. Sigrid set the crystal carefully aside, not wanting to see any more of what the future might hold. They're looking for the last of the Guardian bloodline, and they mean to finish what they started 20 years ago. The implications settled over them like a shroud. Their mountain refuge, which had seemed so secure and isolated, was about to become a trap. 3 against how many? And what did Magnus want with the Guardian tradition that was worth pursuing for 2 decades? Tell me about this Guardian responsibility, Sigrid said. What exactly are we supposed to be protecting? Brynhild moved to a section of the cabin's stone wall that looked no different from any other. But when she pressed a specific sequence of stones, a hidden compartment opened. From within, she withdrew a collection of items that made Sigrid's breath catch: ancient weapons that seemed to shimmer with their own inner light, scrolls covered in runic writing that hurt to look at directly, and small carved totems that radiated an aura of barely contained power. This, Brynhild said simply, the old knowledge, the tools and wisdom that kept the Norse peoples connected to the land itself, to the spirits that dwell within the mountains and forests. When the White Christ came, most of this was lost or destroyed. Our family was entrusted with preserving what remained. Sigrid examined the artifacts with growing wonder. Each piece seemed to call to something deep within her blood, stirring instincts and knowledge she hadn't known she possessed. When she touched a small silver hammer, she suddenly understood its purpose not as a weapon, but as a focus for calling upon the protection of the thunder god. A wooden staff carved with spiraling runes revealed itself as a key for opening pathways between the world of the living and the realm of spirits. "Magnus wants these," she said with certainty. "He wants to use the old power for his own purposes. Then he must not be allowed to have them," Brynhild replied grimly, "even if it costs us our lives." But as they began to plan their defense of the mountain refuge, Sigrid found herself wondering if there might be another way. The vision crystal had shown her Magnus's approach, but it had also revealed something else. The old powers were stronger than either of them had imagined, and they were awakening in response to the renewed threat against their guardians. Outside, the clear skies that had followed the great storm were beginning to cloud over again. But this time the gathering darkness felt different. It felt like the mountains themselves were preparing for war. The shield fragment came to light during their preparations for departure, when Brynhild was gathering weapons from their various hiding places throughout the cabin. She had pulled aside a loose floorboard to retrieve a cache of arrowheads when her fingers encountered something unexpected, a piece of metal wrapped in ancient leather that she had forgotten burying there decades ago. As she unwrapped the artifact, memories flooded back with painful clarity. It was a fragment of her own war shield, broken during the desperate battle she had fought upon, returning to find her settlement destroyed. The piece bore her family crest, a mountain peak surrounded by protective runes etched into steel that had been blessed by the old ceremonies her grandmother had taught her. "What is that?" Sigrid asked, looking up from where she was organizing the mystical artifacts they would need to carry. "Part of my shield, from the day I found Astrid's body," Brynhild replied quietly. "I thought I had lost all the pieces in my grief." Sigrid moved closer to examine the fragment, and the moment her eyes focused on the engraved crest, her entire body went rigid. Her pupils dilated as if she was looking at something infinitely distant, and when she spoke, her voice carried the cadence of someone recounting lived experience rather than vision. "The ravens were circling when you rode into the settlement," she said, her gaze fixed on the shield fragment. "You could smell the smoke from 3 miles away, but you kept hoping it was just cooking fires from the feast hall. When you saw the bodies, you dismounted and went through them one by one, checking faces, praying you wouldn't find the one you were looking for." Brynhild's hands began to shake. "How can you possibly know that?" "You found her by the well," Sigrid continued, still speaking in that distant, recounting tone. "She was wearing her blue dress, the one you had given her for her last birthday. There was blood on the stones around her, and her wooden sword was broken beside her body. She had tried to fight them. Stop! The word came out as a broken whisper, but Sigrid seemed unable to halt the flow of memory that was pouring through her. You knelt beside her for a long time, holding her hand and telling her you were sorry you hadn't been there to protect her. Then you heard voices, some of the raiders returning to loot what they had missed. That's when you picked up your shield and went to meet them. Please stop. There were 5 of them. You killed the first 2 before they even knew you were there. The third one got in a lucky blow that cracked your shield, but you took his head off with your axe. The last 2 tried to run, but you hunted them down like animals because they had taken everything that mattered to you." Brynhild was openly weeping now, the shield fragment clutched against her chest. "How do you know these things? No one else was there." Sigrid blinked several times, her awareness returning to the present moment. "I don't know. When I looked at the shield, it was like I was seeing through your eyes, feeling what you felt. The grief, the rage, the emptiness afterward, it was all so real. The implications struck them both simultaneously. If Sigrid could access memories connected to objects from their family's past, then she was more than just Brynhild's granddaughter. She was somehow linked to the entire bloodline in ways that defied normal understanding. "Try touching this," Brynhild said, reaching into the cache and withdrawing another artifact, a silver arm ring that had belonged to her grandmother. The moment Sigrid's fingers made contact with the ancient jewelry, her eyes widened with wonder instead of pain. "Oh," she breathed. She was so wise, I can feel her presence, her knowledge. She's the one who taught you about the guardian responsibilities. What else can you see? She knew this day would come. She saw it in the rune bones, years before her death, a time when the old bloodline would be reduced to a single guardian, facing overwhelming odds. She made preparations. Sigrid's grip tightened on the arm ring. There are allies we can call upon, powers we can invoke if we know the proper rituals. What kind of allies? The mountain spirits themselves. The land remembers those who have served it faithfully, and it will answer when the need is greatest. Sigrid set the arm ring aside carefully, but the cost is high. To call upon such aid means binding yourself to the mountain forever. No more wandering, no more freedom to choose your own path. Brynhild considered this soberly. She had already given up her freedom once, choosing isolation over engagement with the world. Perhaps it was time to make a different kind of sacrifice, one that would ensure the guardian tradition continued through Sigrid, rather than dying with her own eventual death. What would the binding involve? She asked. A ritual at the peak of the sacred mountain, performed during the dark of the moon. The guardian offers their blood to the ancient stones and pledges to protect the land until death. In return, they receive power enough to face any earthly threat. Sigrid's expression grew troubled, but grandmother's memories also show that once the binding is made, the guardian can never leave these mountains again. The land itself would call them back if they tried. Outside, the weather was shifting ominously. What had been clear skies that morning now showed the steel-grey clouds that promised another storm. But this felt different from the natural weather patterns they had observed, more deliberate, more focused, as if something was deliberately trying to trap them in their mountain refuge until Magnus's forces could arrive. "We're running out of time," Brynhild said, moving to the window to assess the approaching clouds. "If we're going to attempt this binding ritual, it has to be tonight. Once that storm hits, we'll be pinned down here until Magnus finds us." "Are you certain you want to do this?" Sigrid asked. "The commitment is absolute. There's no changing your mind once the ritual is complete." Brynhild looked around the cabin that had been her sanctuary for 20 years, then at the young woman who represented both her past and her future. The choice, when it came down to it, wasn't really a choice at all. "I've been bound to these mountains since the day I arrived here," she said simply. "The ritual will just make it official, and if it gives us power enough to protect the old knowledge and ensure you survive to carry on the bloodline, then it's a price worth paying." They spent the remaining daylight hours in careful preparation, gathering the specific items the ritual would require and planning their route to the sacred peak. As darkness fell and the first snowflakes began to dance outside their windows, both women understood they were about to cross a threshold from which there would be no return. They were halfway up the treacherous path to the sacred peak when Sigrid suddenly stopped, her hand flying to the pendant at her throat. The silver had grown so hot it nearly burned her skin, and the runes carved into its surface were glowing with an intensity that cut through the falling snow like captured starlight. "Something's wrong," she gasped, stumbling against a wind-carved boulder. "The pendant, it's never done this before." Brynhild hurried back to her side, noting the way the mystical artifacts in their packs had begun to resonate in harmony with the pendant's energy. The mountain itself seemed to be responding to whatever was happening, the very stones beneath their feet humming with awakened power. "We should continue," Brynhild urged. "The ritual site isn't much farther, and this storm is getting worse." But Sigrid shook her head, her eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with weather or physical danger. "No, you don't understand. The pendant isn't just reacting to the mountain's power, it's being called by something else. Something I should have remembered before now." She pulled the chain over her head with trembling fingers and held the pendant up to catch the faint moonlight filtering through the storm clouds. As they watched, new symbols began to appear in the silver, runes that hadn't been visible before but now burned with their own inner fire. "Blood calls to blood," Sigrid whispered, reading the ancient script. "Child of my child, daughter of my daughter." born of love and loss, hidden in plain sight until the time of choosing. What does it mean? Brynhild asked, though something deep in her heart already suspected the terrible truth. It means I've been wrong about everything. Sigrid's voice broke as the full implications hit her. I'm not your granddaughter through Astrid. I am Astrid. The words hung in the frigid air like an impossible accusation. Brynhild stared at the young woman beside her, barely 20 summers old, claiming to be her daughter who had died 2 decades ago, and felt her world shift on its axis. That's not possible, she said weakly. I buried Astrid. I held her body in my arms. You buried someone else, a girl who died trying to save me. The pendant's glow intensified as suppressed memories came flooding back to Sigrid. The raiders came while you were away, just as I always remembered. But they didn't kill me immediately. Their leader, Magnus, he recognized the guardian bloodline in me somehow. He knew I would be valuable alive. The visions pouring through the pendant showed her everything with crystalline clarity. A terrified child of 12 summers, watching as Magnus's men murdered everyone she had ever known, then being dragged away as a prize for their leader's collection of mystical artifacts. Years of captivity in his fortress, subjected to rituals designed to drain her connection to the old powers and transfer that energy to him. The slow, agonizing process of having her memories stripped away and replaced with false ones, leaving her as a living vessel for power she couldn't access but couldn't escape. The girl you found and buried, her name was Thora. She was my best friend, and when the raiders came, she put on my clothes and tried to lead them away from where I was hiding. Tears streamed down Sigrid's face as the truth unfolded. Magnus killed her when he realized the deception, but by then I had already been captured by his other men. Brynhild sank to her knees in the snow, overwhelmed by emotions too complex to process. Joy that her daughter lived warred with horror at what she had endured, while guilt over her 20 years of grieving the wrong child nearly crushed her with its weight. The pendant, she managed to say. How does it know the truth? You made it with your own blood when I was born, following the old rituals. It's been fighting Magnus's magic all these years, keeping a piece of my true self hidden where his sorcerers couldn't reach it. Sigrid knelt beside her mother, taking her weathered hands in her own young ones. The night I escaped from his fortress, the pendant finally had enough power to break through the false memories and guide me home to you. But you look so young, 20 summers, just as I should be. Magnus's rituals preserved me at the age I was captured, keeping my body from aging while he slowly drained my spirit. The pendant pulsed again, and more memories surfaced. I remember now, all of it, learning to fight with wooden swords in our courtyard, the stories you told me by the fireplace, the way you used to braid my hair before bed and sing the old lullabies. Brynhild pulled her daughter into a fierce embrace, finally allowing herself to believe what her heart had been telling her since the moment she found this mysterious young woman in the snow. The resemblance that had nagged at her thoughts, the familiar mannerisms, the instant bond she had felt, all of it made sense now. I'm so sorry, she whispered into Astrid's hair. I should have found you. I should have known you were alive. You couldn't have known. Magnus made sure of that. His sorcerers planted evidence that would convince you I was dead, then erased almost everything that made me who I was. Astrid pulled back to meet at her mother's eyes. But now I remember, and the pendant is showing me something else. Magnus isn't just coming for the guardian artifacts. He's coming to reclaim me. I'm the key to unlocking the full power of everything our family has protected. The implications were staggering. If Astrid was right, then Magnus had spent 20 years planning this moment, using her as an unwitting weapon against her own bloodline. The pendant's warmth against her skin meant that his binding spells were finally breaking down, but it also meant he would be able to track her location through the mystical connections he had forged. We need to complete the binding ritual now, Brynhild said urgently. If you're the key he needs, then we have to make sure that key can never be turned. But Astrid shook her head. The blood medallion is showing me a different path. If I willingly return to Magnus, I can turn his own rituals against him. The power he's stolen from me over the years, I can reclaim it. All at once, but only if I face him as his prisoner turned against him. Absolutely not. I won't lose you again. You won't lose me, Mother. But we can't run from this anymore. The pendant's light was growing brighter, and in its glow, Astrid's features seemed to shift between the young woman she appeared to be and glimpses of the 12-year-old child she had been when taken. In 10-4 is when taken to the last. The blood medallion remembers everything our line has faced, and it's showing me that sometimes the only way to win is to let the enemy think they've already won. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of horses echoing off the mountain walls reached them through the storm. Magnus had found them. And his timing was no coincidence. He had been waiting for the pendant's awakening to guide him directly to his prize. "There's no time for the ritual," Brynhild said, rising and drawing her sword. "We fight here." "No," Astrid said firmly. The pendant's power giving her voice an authority that reminded Brynhild of the child who had once commanded wooden armies in their courtyard games. "We do this my way. Trust me, Mother. Trust the blood that binds us and the wisdom our family has carried for 20 generations." The approaching hoofbeats grew louder, and Brynhild realized that her daughter, returned to her against all hope and reason, was about to walk willingly back into the nightmare that had stolen 20 years of both their lives. The war horn's deep, resonant call echoed across the mountain peaks like the voice of the gods themselves, summoning powers that had slumbered for generations. Brynhild lifted the ancient instrument from her lips, feeling the vibration of its sound in her very bones as it awakened something primal in the stone and snow around them. She had retrieved the horn from its sacred resting place during their hurried descent from the ritual site, knowing that what they were about to face would require every advantage their bloodline could muster. "I can feel them responding," Astrid whispered, her hand still clutched around the glowing pendant. "The mountain spirits, the ancestor guardians, they're coming." Magnus's voice carried clearly through the winter air as his men surrounded the rocky outcropping where mother and daughter had taken their stand. "Astrid, my dear child, surely you remember the futility of resistance. Return to me willingly, and I'll make your mother's death quick." The casual way he spoke of murder made Brynhild's grip tighten on her war axe, the weapon that had hung above her fireplace for 20 years now, singing with its own eager bloodlust. But Astrid placed a restraining hand on her arm, her young face set with determination that reminded Brynhild powerfully of the stubborn child who had once insisted on training with the boys, despite everyone's protests. "I remember everything now, Magnus," Astrid called back, stepping forward so she could be clearly seen in the torchlight his men carried. "I remember how you broke the minds of children to steal their power, how you perverted the old rituals to serve your greed. And I remember the promise you made that when I had served your purposes, you would let me die." A harsh laugh echoed off the stone walls. "Death was always an option, yes, but you've become far too valuable to waste on sentiment. The power you've absorbed over the years, combined with your bloodline heritage, you could make me the most powerful sorcerer in all the northern lands." "Could," Astrid agreed, "but that assumes I'm still the broken tool you shaped in your dungeons." She lifted the pendant high above her head, and its light blazed forth with such intensity that Magnus's men had to shield their eyes. In that brilliant illumination, the true extent of their preparation became visible. Brynhild had not simply chosen this defensive position at random. She had led them to the ancient circle of standing stones, where her grandmother had first taught her the guardian rituals decades ago. The megalithic monuments, weathered by centuries of mountain storms, began to resonate with the pendant's energy. Runes carved into their surfaces so old they predated written history flared to life one by one, creating a protective barrier that made Magnus's horses shy nervously away from the circle's edge. "Impressive," Magnus admitted, his voice closer now as he dismounted and approached on foot. but ultimately pointless. The binding rituals I used on you can't be broken by simple bloodline magic. You are mine, child, as surely as if I had forged chains of iron around your soul. That's where you're wrong, Astrid replied, her voice carrying a new note of power that made the very air around her shimmer. The rituals you used required my consent, even if that consent was coerced through torture and despair. But now, I withdraw that consent freely and completely. She pressed the pendant against her heart, and for a moment her entire form blazed with the same silver light that poured from the ancient jewelry. When the radiance faded, she looked subtly different, older, more solid, as if she was finally fully present in her own body after years of existing as a half-real ghost of herself. Magnus stepped into view at the circle's edge, and Brynhild felt her breath catch at the sight of him. 20 years had aged the man who had destroyed her world, turning his hair silver and lining his face with the cost of the dark magic he wielded. But his eyes remained the same ice-blue windows into a soul utterly devoid of mercy or remorse. "You can reject the bindings all you like," he said conversationally, "but you cannot change what you are, a vessel I shaped, filled with power I harvested, prepared over 2 decades to serve my ultimate purpose. Your rebellion only adds spice to an otherwise predictable conclusion." Behind him, his warriors spread out in a practiced formation, their weapons gleaming with more than reflected torchlight. Each blade bore runes of binding and compulsion, meant to subdue rather than kill their targets. Magnus wanted them alive for whatever final ritual he had planned. "Tell me about this ultimate purpose," Astrid said, apparently untroubled by the armed men surrounding their position. 20 years is a long time to nurture a single plan. It must be something truly magnificent to justify such patience. Magnus smiled, and the expression transformed his weathered features into something genuinely terrifying. "The old gods are returning, child. The White Christ's hold on the northern lands grows weak, and people hunger for the strength their ancestors knew. With your power channeling the guardian bloodline's accumulated wisdom, I can become the conduit through which Thor and Odin speak to the world. Again, I can rebuild the old empire and rule it in their name. And the cost of this grand vision? Every living guardian, starting with your mother. Their deaths will release the binding energies that have protected the mountain for centuries, and those energies will flow into you. Then, when I take your power for my own, I'll have command over forces not seen since the age of legends." The casual way he outlined genocide made Brynhild's hand move instinctively toward her sword, but Astrid caught her wrist and held it firmly. The war horn hung at Brynhild's side, its ancient bronze surface warm to the touch, as if eager to sound again. "There's one flaw in your plan," Astrid observed, her tone remaining conversational despite the mortal threat they faced. "You assume the guardian bloodline has been passive all these years, simply accumulating power for you to harvest. But we've been preparing too, Magnus, preparing for exactly this moment." She gestured to the standing stones around them, and Brynhild realized for the first time that the runes glowing on their surfaces weren't just random protective symbols. They formed a pattern, a great ritual circle that had been decades in the making. Every stone her grandmother had blessed, every ritual Brynhild had performed during her years of solitude, every moment of Astrid's captivity, all of it had been building toward this confrontation. "The mountain remembers every guardian who has died in its service," Astrid continued. "Their spirits have been waiting, patient as the stone itself, for someone worthy to call them forth. Not to serve a tyrant's ambition, but to protect what they spent their lives defending." Magnus's confident expression flickered with the first hint of uncertainty. "Impossible. The dead cannot return to fight among the living. They can, if the need is great enough, and the call is made by one who shares their blood." Astrid raised the pendant again, and this time its light was answered by phosphorescent glows from the weapons and armor scattered around their feet, the sacred artifacts of their bloodline, each one touched by the spirit of its former wielder. "Mother," Astrid said softly, It's time to sound the horn again. Brynhild lifted the war horn to her lips, understanding finally flooding through her. This wasn't just a call to battle, it was a summoning, a plea for aid directed not at the living but at the honored dead, who had sworn the same oath she and her daughter now upheld. The horn's voice boomed across the mountain peaks, deeper and more resonant than any earthly instrument should have been able to produce. And in response, the very air around the standing stones began to shimmer with half-seen forms, the spirits of guardians past, rising from whatever realm had claimed them to stand once more in defense of their sacred trust. Magnus stepped backward involuntarily, his face pale with sudden understanding. "You would invoke the restless dead against me." "Not restless," Brynhild corrected, her voice carrying the authority of 20 generations of guardians. "Willing. They come because they choose to, because the cause is just and the need is real." Around them, the ghostly figures solidified just enough to be clearly visible men and women in ancient armor, bearing weapons that glowed with their own inner light. At their head stood a figure Brynhild recognized from family stories. Her great-grandmother Sigrid, the first guardian to bear the mountain's trust, her spirit blazing with righteous fury at the sight of what Magnus had done to her descendants. "Now," Astrid whispered, "we finish what you started 20 years ago." The battle erupted with the fury of a mountain avalanche as Magnus's men charged the sacred circle, their enchanted weapons clashing against the spectral guardians who rose to meet them. Brynhild felt her legendary sword burst into flame the moment her fingers closed around its grip, the blade that had earned her the name Unflinching, blazing with mystical fire as it recognized the righteousness of her cause. 20 years of peaceful mountain living fell away in an instant, replaced by the deadly instincts that had made her one of the most feared shield maidens in all of Norway. Her first opponent was a young warrior whose confidence crumbled when he realized his enchanted blade could not penetrate the flame that wreathed her weapon. The fire consumed his steel as if it were kindling, and her riposte took his head cleanly from his shoulders. "For Astrid!" she roared, the battle cry that had once struck terror into Danish raiders now echoing across the stone circle with renewed power. Beside her, Astrid moved with the fluid grace of someone finally able to access training that had been suppressed by years of magical bondage. Though she carried no weapon, the pendant at her throat blazed with such intensity that Magnus's warriors could not look directly at her. When they tried to strike, their blades passed through empty air, as if she had become incorporeal, while her touch drained the enchantments from their equipment and left them holding ordinary steel. The ghostly guardians fought with the terrible efficiency of warriors unencumbered by mortal concerns. They needed no rest, felt no pain, and their spirit weapons cut through both armor and flesh with equal ease. Magnus's carefully planned assault began to crumble, as his men found themselves outnumbered by enemies who could not be killed because they were already dead. Magnus himself had withdrawn to a safe distance, his hands weaving complex patterns in the air as he attempted to reassert control over Astrid through the bindings he had placed on her. But each spell he cast was absorbed harmlessly by the pendant, which seemed to feed on his dark magic and grow brighter with every failed attempt at compulsion. "Impossible," he snarled, sweat beading on his forehead despite the frigid mountain air. 20 years of careful preparation cannot be undone by mere sentiment." "It wasn't sentiment that freed me," Astrid replied, ducking beneath a warrior's desperate swing and touching her hand to his chest. The man collapsed instantly as the life force Magnus had stolen from a dozen captives drained back out of him. "It was love, something you never understood and never could control." 3 of Magnus's warriors lay dead around the base of the standing stones, while 2 more fled into the darkness rather than face the spectral army that opposed them. But the sorcerer himself seemed unconcerned by these losses, his attention focused entirely on the complex ritual he was weaving with gesture and whispered incantation. "If I cannot reclaim you through the old bindings," he said, his voice taking on an otherworldly resonance. "Then I'll simply take what I need by force." Dark energy began to pour from his hands like liquid shadow, reaching toward Astrid with tendrils that seemed to drink light from the air around them. The pendant's glow faltered for the first time as Magnus's most powerful magic met the ancestral protections that guarded her. And Brynhild realized with growing horror that her daughter was being slowly overwhelmed. The flame blade sang as she carved through two more of Magnus's warriors, but she couldn't reach the sorcerer himself. He had positioned himself carefully beyond the circle's edge, where the guardian spirits could not follow. The ancient compact that bound them to this place also limited their ability to pursue enemies who fled its boundaries. "Mother, the horn!" Astrid gasped, her form flickering as Magnus's shadow magic began to drain the power from her pendant. "Call them back to you before it's too late!" But as Brynhild raised the war horn to her lips again, she saw that Magnus had anticipated this move as well. The remaining members of his force, 4 hardened veterans who had stayed back as reserves, now charged directly toward her, their weapons aimed not at her body, but at the ancient instrument that was their connection to the spirit realm. The choice crystallized in a single heartbeat. She could sound the horn and summon the full might of her ancestral guardians, but doing so would leave her defenseless against the approaching warriors. Or she could defend herself and watch as Magnus slowly drained the life from her newly recovered daughter. Instead, she chose a third option. With a roar that would have done credit to her legendary reputation, Brynhild hurled herself directly at the 4 warriors, the flame blade carving a path through their formation like lightning splitting the sky. She felt steel bite deep into her shoulder as one man's sword found its mark, but her own weapon took him in the heart, even as his blade drew her blood. The horn fell from her wounded hand, clattering against the stone as she spun to face the next attacker. The flame that wreathed her sword burned brighter than ever, fed by her determination to protect what mattered most. But she could feel her strength beginning to ebb from the wound that painted the ancient stones red beneath her feet. Above them all, Magnus's triumph echoed across the mountain peaks as his dark magic finally overwhelmed Astrid's defenses and began the process of claiming her accumulated power for his own. As Magnus's dark magic closed around her like chains forged from shadow and malice, Astrid felt something extraordinary begin to manifest upon her brow, a crown of twisted silver that seemed to emerge from the very air itself, its ethereal metal catching the pendant's fading light and transforming it into something far more powerful. The spirit crown had been worn by the first guardian of their bloodline, and its appearance now marked her complete acceptance of the responsibility that was her birthright. The moment the crown settled upon her head, everything changed. The shadow tendrils that had been draining her strength suddenly reversed their flow, and Magnus staggered backward as the power he had stolen from a dozen captives over the years came rushing back into its rightful vessel. The pendant blazed with renewed intensity, but now it was merely one source of light among many, as the spirit crown channeled the accumulated wisdom and strength of 20 generations of guardians. "No," Magnus snarled, pouring more of his own life force into the ritual in a desperate attempt to maintain control. "I will not be denied by a child." But Astrid was no longer the broken tool he had shaped in his dungeons. The crown had awakened memories and abilities that went far beyond her individual experience, connecting her to a legacy of power that predated his birth by centuries. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that seemed to emerge from the mountain itself. "You were never denied by a child, Magnus. You are being stopped by the mountain, by the spirits of the honored dead, and by the unbreakable will of those who serve something greater than themselves." Around them, the spectral guardians rallied as their descendant finally claimed her full inheritance. Where before they had fought as individual warriors, now they moved as a coordinated force, directed by a single, implacable will. Magnus's remaining soldiers found themselves facing opponents who anticipated their every move and countered their strategies before they could even form them. Brynhild, bleeding but still defiant, carved through the last of her attackers with the flame blade that burned brighter than any earthly fire. The mystical weapon responded to her daughter's transformation by becoming something beyond mere steel, a conduit for the righteous fury that had driven 20 generations of guardians to defend what they held sacred. "Together, Mother," Astrid called, her form now blazing with the combined light of crown and pendant, as it was meant to be from the beginning. Understanding flooded through Brynhild as she raised the flame blade high above her head. This was why fate had brought them together again, why the mountain had arranged for her to find Astrid in the snow. The guardian tradition had never been meant for a single protector struggling alone. It was a legacy that required the combined strength of family bonds to reach its true potential. Their power merged as grandmother's sword met granddaughter's crown in a blaze of silver fire that turned night into day across the entire mountain range. The fusion of their abilities created something that neither Magnus's stolen magic nor his years of careful planning could have anticipated, a force that drew not just on their individual strength, but on the love that connected them. Across decades of separation and pain, Magnus screamed as his binding rituals shattered like glass, the dark energy he had woven around himself for 20 years, turning inward and consuming the very soul that had created it. The warriors he had enthralled broke free of his control, their eyes clearing as they realized what they had been forced to become in service to his ambition. "This cannot be," he gasped, his form beginning to waver as the power that had sustained him beyond normal human lifespan finally abandoned him. "I was meant to rule. The old gods promised me dominion over. The old gods promise nothing to those who pervert their gifts." Astrid interrupted, her voice now carrying the authority of every guardian who had ever lived. "You sought power for its own sake, never understanding that true strength comes from sacrifice and service." The spirit crown's light intensified until Magnus was forced to shield his eyes, and in that brilliant illumination, the truth of his defeat became clear. He had spent decades accumulating stolen power, but power without purpose was merely destruction waiting to turn on itself. The Guardians drew their strength from something far more enduring, the love of family and the willingness to give everything in defense of what they protected. Magnus's final scream echoed across the mountains as his form dissolved into shadow and was scattered by winds that carried the scent of spring even in the depths of winter. Where he had stood, only a small pile of ash remained, already being dispersed by the gentle breeze that seemed to sigh with relief at the ending of his long tyranny. The spectral guardians began to fade as their task reached completion, but not before each one turned toward Astrid and offered the salute traditionally given to a worthy leader. Her great-grandmother's spirit lingered longest, her ghostly features filled with pride at seeing the bloodline secured for another generation. As the last of the guardian spirits vanished into whatever realm awaited them, Astrid sank to her knees beside her wounded mother, the spirit crown dissolving into motes of silver light that danced briefly in the air before settling into the ancient stones around them. The battle was won, the enemy defeated, and the sacred trust preserved for those who would come after. But victory, Brynhild reflected as her daughter's healing touch began to mend her wounds, was only the beginning of their story together. 3 months had passed since the battle at the Stone Circle, and spring had come to the mountains with unusual warmth and abundance. Where Magnus's shadow magic had once poisoned the land, new growth flourished with remarkable vitality, as if the earth itself was celebrating its freedom from his corrupting influence. Brynhild stood in the doorway of their rebuilt cabin, watching as Astrid tended the memorial cairn they had constructed on the hillside overlooking their home. The healing had taken time, not just the physical recovery from their wounds, but the deeper work of rebuilding a relationship that had been severed by 20 years of separation and deception. They had approached each other cautiously at first, like strangers learning to share a space, before gradually rediscovering the bonds that connected mother and daughter across decades of loss. "She's adding another stone," Brynhild observed to herself, noting how Astrid carefully selected each piece of granite for the growing monument. The cairn honored not just the memory of young Thora, who had died wearing Astrid's clothes, but all the victims of Magnus's long reign of terror. They had found dozens of names in his abandoned fortress, children and young adults who had vanished over the years to feed his hunger for mystical power. Today, however, was special. Astrid lifted a smooth river stone from her pouch, the new beginning stone she had found during their morning walk, and placed it deliberately at the cairn's peak. The gesture was both practical and symbolic. This stone marked not an ending but a continuation, the start of a future that honored the past while embracing change. "Mother, come see," Astrid called, her voice carrying the contentment that had gradually replaced the haunted quality it had held during their first weeks together. "I think the cairn is finally complete." Brynhild made her way up the gentle slope, noting how her daughter moved with the confident grace of someone who had found her place in the world. The pendant still hung at Astrid's throat, but its urgent glow had settled into a steady warmth that spoke of balance rather than crisis. The spirit crown had not manifested again since the night of battle, though they both sensed it remained available should the need arise. "Tell me about the stone," Brynhild said, settling beside her daughter on the wooden bench they had built, facing the memorial. "I found it in the stream where the water runs clearest," Astrid replied, her fingers tracing the stone's smooth surface. "Grandmother's memories told me that such stones represent new beginnings, transitions from one phase of life to another. I thought it was appropriate for today. Today marked exactly 3 months since Magnus's defeat, but more importantly, it was the day they had decided to formally establish their new life together. No longer was Brynhild a hermit fleeing from painful memories, nor was Astrid a lost soul with no knowledge of her heritage. They were guardians in the truest sense, protectors not just of ancient artifacts, but of the wisdom and traditions that gave those objects meaning. "The visitors should arrive soon," Brynhild observed, noting the position of the sun above the eastern peaks. Word of Magnus's defeat had spread through the hidden networks that still honored the old ways, and today would bring the first of many pilgrims seeking guidance from the restored guardian bloodline. "Are you ready for that?" Astrid asked. 20 years of solitude, and now we'll be hosting scholars and truth-seekers almost daily." Brynhild considered the question carefully. The isolation that had once been her refuge now felt limiting rather than protective. She had learned during their months together that sharing knowledge multiplied rather than diminished it, and that the guardian tradition was meant to serve the living rather than simply preserve artifacts for an uncertain future. "I'm ready," she said simply. "We both are." The old knowledge was never meant to be hoarded. It was meant to help people find their way in difficult times. They had spent weeks organizing the mystical artifacts in their new arrangement, creating a space that was part library, part sanctuary, and part teaching hall. The healing stones occupied places of honor near the windows, where their gentle light could welcome visitors. The vision crystal had been set into a special stand that allowed seekers to glimpse their own paths forward rather than dwelling on past traumas. The ancestor scroll now lay open for study, its ancient wisdom available to any who possessed the dedication to learn its secrets. "Do you ever regret it?" Astrid asked quietly. "Giving up the simple life for all this responsibility?" Brynhild reached over and took her daughter's hand, marveling at how natural the gesture had become, after decades of having no one to touch with affection. "How could I regret finding my family again? How could either of us regret discovering that love is stronger than any magic a tyrant can weave?" In the distance, they could see the first group of travelers making their way up the mountain path. 3 women and an older man, their careful pace suggesting both respect for the terrain and awareness that they approached sacred ground. These were not casual visitors, but serious students of the old traditions, people who understood that knowledge came with obligations as well as privileges. "Come," Astrid said, rising from the bench and offering her hand to her mother. "Let's go prepare to welcome them properly." As they walked back toward the cabin together, Brynhild reflected on the strange turns fate had taken to bring them to this moment. The grief that had driven her into isolation had ultimately positioned her to save the daughter she thought she'd lost. The years of captivity that had stolen Astrid's memories had also preserved her long enough for their reunion. Even Magnus's evil had served a purpose, forcing them to discover strengths they never knew they possessed. The new beginning stone caught the afternoon light as they passed the memorial cairn, its surface reflecting the sky above in a way that suggested infinite possibilities stretching toward the horizon. Behind them, the mountain peaks stood sentinel against the blue heavens, their ancient presence a reminder that some things endure beyond the span of any single lifetime. The guardian tradition would continue, passed down through love and teaching rather than desperation and loss. And at its heart would always be the truth they had learned in the stone circle, that the greatest power comes not from what we take for ourselves, but from what we willingly give to protect those we love.